Before we start talking about ratios, remember that triangles don't just have 3 sides, they also have 3 angles. An angle is just 2 rays that share a common vertex. Where we start is called the initial side, where we end is called the terminal side. If I go in the counterclockwise direction, my angle is going to be positive. If I start on my initial side and go in the clockwise position, my angle will be negative. An angle whose initial side lies on the positive x-axis is called an angle in standard position. We measure angles 2 ways, by degrees and radians. I think we are all familiar with degrees. If I start on my initial side, if I start this angle in standard position, my initial side is on the positive x-axis, and I go in the counterclockwise direction. Everybody knows that there are 360 degrees in a circle. So a full rotation, or this angle, would be 360 degrees. What about radians? If I look at this same circle and draw a radius, and say this radius is 1, how many of these radii do you think it would take to fill up this circle? Well, if I start just laying it down to see how many times I use it, it looks like there's a little bit more than 6 of these to cover this circle. Well, remember that pi is pretty important when it comes to circles. Pi is a little over 3. 3.14 is an approximation. So a little over 6 would actually be exactly 2 pi. So 360 degrees is the same thing as 2 pi radians. Let's look at this. 0 degrees, 0 radians. 360 degrees, 2 pi radians. If I go half a rotation, half a 360, this would be 180 degrees, or pi radians. If I go at a right angle, we know that a right angle has 90 degrees, or half of pi, or pi over 2. And 90 plus 90 plus 90 is 270 degrees, or in radians, this is 3 pi over 2 radians. What does this mean? Well, it means that if there are 180 degrees in pi radians, right? 180 degrees is the same thing as pi radians. If I divide both of these by 180, that means that 1 degree has pi over 180 radians. Or, if I did the same thing, but divided both sides by pi, then I know that 180 over pi is 1 radian. Simply put, to convert from radians to degrees, you multiply by 180 over pi. To convert from degrees to radians, you multiply by pi over 180. Let's do some examples. So these examples are from 6.1, and I've actually numbered them so you can look back in your text to see, but I'm converting 36 degrees to radians, which means if I'm going from degrees to radians, I multiply by pi over 180. Pi over 180 is how I go from degrees to radians. Now I just simplify this. If you don't automatically look at this and think, I know that 36 goes into 180 5 times, just start basic. You know that both of these are even numbers, so divide both by 2. Then divide that by 2, and keep going until you're in its simplest form. After I simplify this, I multiply straight across. So I've got pi over 5. 36 degrees is pi over 5 in terms of radians. Let's do a negative. Remember, a negative degree, if I were looking at this, I would be going clockwise in the clockwise direction from my initial side. It's not going to change though. I'm still going to take my negative 150 and multiply by pi over 180. Maybe this one's a little easier to simplify. I know my zeros cancel out because both divide by 10. And then I'm just looking at 15 and 8. Well, I know that 3 goes into 15 5 times, 3 goes into 8 6 times, 18 6 times. So in radians, this is negative 5 pi over 6. Let's go the other way with it. Now I've got radians, and I want to convert this to degrees. To convert radians to degrees, I multiply by 180 over pi. If I've got pi in my initial problem, what always happens to these pi's? Those cancel out. This is also a good way to remember whether you multiply by 180 over pi or pi over 180, because if you're going from radians to degrees, you want those pi's to cancel out. When I simplify this, I've got 180, let's go ahead and cross cancel some more. 4 will go into 180 45 times. So I've got everything canceling out except my 3 and my 45. 3 times 45 is 135 degrees. Alright, so far so good. I'm going to do one more from this section in 6.1. This is still in the section from going from radians to degrees. Notice that I don't have a pi here, but that doesn't matter. I'm still converting to degrees, so I multiply by 180 over pi. When I multiply by 180 over pi, I get 540 over pi. Well, what does this mean in degrees? It doesn't mean anything in degrees because I need to put it in my calculator and see how many degrees approximately this is. Make sure your calculator is in degree mode when you do this, and just divide 540 divided by pi, and you should get, what is the answer? I'm going to approximate it to 1 decimal. It's 171.9.